welcome. We're so happy you're here. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe and become part of our growing family. Thank you for joining our community. My name is Charleen, and if you had asked me 20 years ago whether I would ever sit down and tell this story out loud, I would have laughed in a way that wasn't really a laugh. It would have been the kind of sound a person makes when the truth is too heavy to carry and too dangerous to set down. I want to begin by thanking you for being here, because what I'm about to share isn't a spectacle, and it isn't a confession dressed up as entertainment. It's a life. My life. And the life of the person I used to be, who I sometimes still grieve and sometimes still thank, because without him, I wouldn't be here at all. I was born in a small town where the streets were narrow and the opinions were narrower. My father worked with his hands and my mother worked with her patience, and between them they built a house that was clean, quiet, and predictable. I was the middle child, which meant I learned early how to disappear into the wallpaper when the room got loud. I had an older brother who was everything a father in that town could ask for, and a younger sister who was everything a mother in that town could dote on, and I was the one in the middle, watching, listening, and slowly beginning to notice that the shape of me did not quite match the outline the world had drawn for me. I don't want to romanticize the beginning, because the beginning wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no single afternoon where I looked in a mirror and understood myself. The truth of my early years was much smaller, and much stranger than that. It was the way I lingered a moment too long at the aisle in the department store where the girls' clothes hung. It was the way I felt a small, private ache when I watched my sister get her hair braided and knew, somehow, that I wanted to be the one sitting in that chair. It was the way I would try, at 7 or 8 years old, to walk with a lightness I saw in the women on television, and then correct myself quickly before anyone noticed. Children notice things about themselves long before they have the language for them, and I noticed. I just didn't have a single word to hold what I was noticing. The first time I put on something that wasn't meant for me, I was 9 years old. My mother had left a scarf on the back of a kitchen chair, a soft blue thing with a pattern of small white flowers, and I picked it up because it looked like the sky in early morning. I tied it around my head the way I had seen her do it, and I stood in front of the hallway mirror, and for a moment, a very short moment, I felt like I had exhaled for the first time in my life. Then I heard footsteps, and I ripped the scarf off my head so quickly that I nearly tore it, and I put it back on the chair, and I ran to my room and closed the door, and sat on the floor with my heart beating so loudly I was sure the whole house could hear it. I want to be clear about what that moment was, and what it wasn't. It wasn't about the scarf. It wasn't about wanting to be pretty. It was about the fact that for one small breath, I had seen a version of myself that felt true, and then I had been terrified of her, and I had hidden her, and I had learned in that single afternoon that the truest parts of me would have to live in secret. Growing up, I did what a lot of children like me do. I overcompensated. I played the sports my brother played, even though I was clumsy at them, and my knees were always bruised. I laughed at the jokes the other boys laughed at, even when the jokes made my stomach turn. I learned the vocabulary of masculinity the way an immigrant learns a second language, carefully, deliberately, always aware that my accent might give me away. I got good at it. I got so good at it that by the time I was 15, I could pass through an entire day without a single person suspecting that inside my chest there was a girl standing very still, holding her breath, waiting for the world to go to sleep, so she could come out for a moment and stretch. The teenage years were the hardest, and I want to say that plainly because I know there are people watching this who are in those years right now, and I don't want to lie to you and tell you it was easy. It wasn't. Puberty was a betrayal. My body began to change in ways that felt like a door slamming shut on a room I had barely been allowed to enter. My voice dropped, and I remember standing in the bathroom the morning I first heard it come out lower than I expected, and I cried, and I didn't know why I was crying, and I couldn't tell anyone because how do you explain to your father that you are grieving your own voice? Hair grew where I didn't want it. My shoulders broadened. My jaw squared. And every morning I woke up feeling like a stranger was slowly moving into the house of my body, and I was being pushed further and further into the attic. I began to sneak. I'm not proud of this part of the story, and I'm not going to pretend it was noble, because it wasn't. It was survival, but it was also deception, and I have had to make peace with both of those things. I would wait until my parents were asleep, and I would slip into my sister's room, and I would borrow, just for an hour, a dress or a blouse or a pair of tights, and I would sit in the bathroom with the door locked and the light dimmed, and I would look at myself in the mirror and I would breathe. That was it. I didn't do anything dramatic. I just breathed. Because in those borrowed clothes, in that dim bathroom, I was allowed to exist as the person I actually was, and the relief of it was so enormous that I would sometimes sit on the cold tile floor afterward and cry for reasons I couldn't have named at the time. I got caught once. My sister came home early from a sleepover and found me in her room with her cardigan halfway over my head, and the look on her face is something I will carry with me until the day I die. It wasn't disgust, exactly. It was confusion and hurt and a kind of fear that I understood immediately because it was the same fear I felt every day. She didn't tell her parents. I want to say that clearly because it matters. She sat down on the edge of her bed and she looked at me for a long time and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Okay." And that was the whole conversation. She didn't ask me to explain myself and she didn't tell me I was wrong and she didn't tell me I was right. She just let me be a person in a room with her for a moment, and then she asked if I wanted a sandwich. I have thought about that sandwich for 30 years. I've thought about how sometimes the greatest kindness one person can offer another is simply the willingness to keep sitting in the same room with them after they have seen them clearly. But the fear didn't go away. If anything, being seen made the fear worse because now there was a witness, and witnesses can change their minds. I began to be more careful. I began to hide things better. I bought a small box at a hardware store, the kind with a cheap combination lock, and I kept it under a loose floorboard in the back of my closet, and inside it I kept the small collection of things that were mine, and only mine. A skirt I had bought at a thrift store 2 towns over. A tube of lipstick I had shoplifted, which I am not proud of and which I eventually paid back for years later by leaving an anonymous envelope of cash at that same store. A pair of earrings that clipped on, because I hadn't dared to pierce my ears. That box was the smallest and most honest room in my entire life, and I visited it the way other people visit church. I went to college far away from home, which was the first decision I ever made purely for myself. I chose a school in a city I had never been to, in a state I had never visited, and I packed my things into the back of an old car, and I drove for 2 days without stopping for anything except gas and cheap coffee, and when I crossed the state line I rolled down the window, and I let the wind take the last of the small town air out of my hair. I thought, foolishly, that geography would fix me. I thought that if I just went far enough away from the people who knew the boy version of me, I would arrive somewhere and find that the girl inside me had grown into a woman on the drive, and I could simply step out of the car and begin. That is not what happened. What happened was that I arrived in a new city with the same old fear, and I discovered that fear is very good at packing itself into suitcases. In college, I met a woman named Elena, and I fell in love with her the way you fall in love when you are young, and you don't yet know that love cannot save you from yourself. Elena was kind and funny, and she read books I had never heard of, and she looked at me with an attention that was so patient it sometimes frightened me. I did not tell her about the box under the floorboard. I did not tell her about the scarf, or the bathroom, or the sister's cardigan. I told myself that I would tell her eventually, and then I told myself that if I loved her enough, the need to tell her would go away. This was the first great lie I told about myself in my adult life, and it cost both of us dearly. We were together for 6 years. We got engaged. We picked out an apartment with a small balcony that got the morning sun, and we adopted a cat named Peppercorn who only liked one of us at a time. And the entire time I was living 2 lives. One life was the life Elena could see, the man she was going to marry, the partner who made her coffee in the morning and rubbed her feet when she came home from long shifts at the hospital. The other life was the life I lived in the 20 minutes between her leaving for work and me leaving for mine, when I would put on a blouse and a skirt and sit at the kitchen table and drink my coffee as the person I actually was, and then I would take it all off and hide it and go pretend to be someone else for another 10 hours. I want to tell you honestly that this arrangement felt, for a while, like a compromise I could live with. And then it began to feel like a slow-motion drowning. Elena figured out the way people always figure these things out, which is to say gradually, and then all at once. She found a receipt. She noticed a hair on a blouse that wasn't hers and wasn't the length of mine. She began to ask small questions with big silences around them. I lied, and I lied, and I lied, and each lie made the next one easier and the truth further away, and one night she sat me down at our kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk my secret coffees, and she said, "I don't think you're cheating on me, but I think you're hiding something, and I need you to tell me what it is, because I can't marry a locked door. I want to be honest about what I did next." I told her a version of the truth. I told her that I sometimes wore women's clothes, and I framed it as a hobby, a stress relief, a small strange thing that many men do in private. I did not tell her that when I wore those clothes I felt, for the first time all day, like I was breathing. I gave her the smallest, safest piece of the truth, because I was still too afraid to hand her the whole thing. She tried. God bless her, she tried. She said she could handle it. She said she loved me, and that we would figure it out. And for about a year, we did figure it out in a fashion. She let me wear what I wanted at home. She bought me a scarf for my birthday, a soft blue one with small white flowers on it, and I cried when I opened it because she had no way of knowing what that particular pattern meant to me, and yet somehow she had known. But the small truth I had given her was not the whole truth, and the whole truth kept growing, and eventually she looked at me one evening and said, "You are becoming someone I don't know, and I don't think you are becoming her for me." And she was right. She was right in a way that took my breath away. I was not becoming Charleen for Elena. I was becoming Charleen because Charleen had been waiting my entire life to be born, and the pregnancy could not be indefinitely extended. We ended the engagement. It was the most painful conversation of my life, and it was also, in a strange and terrible way, the most honest. She did not scream at me. She did not call me names. She sat across from me and she cried, and she said, "I hope you find her, and I hope she is worth all of this." And then she packed a bag and she went to stay with her sister, and I sat alone in the apartment with peppercorn on my lap, and I understood for the first time that I had spent my entire life trying to be a person who did not exist, and that the cost of that project had just been paid, in full, by someone who did not owe the debt. The years after Elena were the darkest years of my life, and I want to talk about them carefully because I know some of you watching are in dark years of your own. I fell into a depression that had a weight to it, a physical weight, as though someone had draped a wet coat over my shoulders, and I could not remember how to take it off. I stopped eating regularly. I stopped calling my family. I went to work and I came home and I sat on the couch and I watched the light change on the wall, and I thought about how much of my life I had already spent hiding, and I thought about how much of it I had left, and the math frightened me. I want to say clearly because I think it is important that I had thoughts during that time that scared me. I did not act on them, but they were there, and I will not pretend they weren't, because pretending is what got me into that room in the first place. What saved me, and I use that word carefully because I don't believe in easy salvations, was a woman named Dr. Marisol Vega. She was a therapist I found through a community clinic that charged on a sliding scale, and I chose her, honestly, because she had the earliest available appointment. I walked into her office expecting to talk about my breakup, and I ended up in the third session telling her about the scarf. I had never told anyone about the scarf. Not Elena, not my sister, not myself, not really. And Dr. Vega listened, and she did not flinch, and she did not celebrate, and she did not diagnose me on the spot. She said, "That sounds like a very important memory. Tell me more about the color of the flowers." And something in me, some old locked thing, began very slowly to open. I want to talk about therapy because I think our culture still treats it like something shameful or indulgent, and it is neither. Therapy with Dr. Vega was not a magic wand. It was work. It was the hardest work I have ever done. It was sitting in a small room week after week and being asked to say true things out loud, and discovering that many of the true things I had been carrying were actually much smaller and more manageable once they were out of my body and in the air between us. She never told me who I was. That is the thing I want people to understand about good therapy. She never once said, "You are a woman," or "You are a crossdresser," or "You are transgender," or "You are any of the words that the world was so eager to hand me." She asked me questions, and she let me arrive at my own answers, and when I arrived at them, she asked me if I was sure, and when I said I was sure, she asked me what I wanted to do about it, and when I didn't know what I wanted to do, she said, "Then let's sit with not knowing for a while, because not knowing is also a place a person can live." For 2 years, I lived in not knowing. I explored. I went, for the first time in my life, to a support group. I want to describe that first meeting because I remember every detail of it. It was in the basement of a community center, and the room smelled like old coffee and floor wax, and there were folding chairs arranged in a lopsided circle, and there were 9 people there, and I was the 10th. Some of them were dressed in clothes that matched the gender they had been assigned at birth, and some of them were not, and some of them were in the middle of medical transition, and some of them had no interest in medical transition at all, and what struck me sitting there with my hands folded in my lap was that no 2 of them were the same. I had walked into that room expecting to find a template. I had expected to find a script I could follow. Instead, I found 9 different people living 9 different lives, and I understood, sitting in that folding chair, that whatever I was going to become, I was going to have to become it on my own terms, because no one else's map would fit my particular country. I began, slowly, to build a life that had more of me in it. I started wearing what I wanted at home, all the time, without hiding it when a friend came over. I let my hair grow. I began, very carefully, to speak with a voice that felt more like mine, first only when I was alone, and then only with a small circle of trusted people, and then, eventually, out in the world. I chose the name Charleen because it had been my grandmother's name, and my grandmother had been the first adult in my life who had ever looked at me and seen me clearly, even when I could not see myself. She had died when I was 12, and I had never gotten to tell her anything about who I really was, but I had a memory of her sitting on a porch swing with me one summer evening, and she had said, "Whoever you turn out to be, you make sure you turn out to be all of it." I don't think she knew what she was saying. I don't think she needed to. Some blessings work whether the person giving them understands them or not. Telling my family was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I want to talk about it honestly, because I know many of you are considering conversations like this one, and I don't want to give you a fairy tale. My mother cried. She cried in a way that I had not seen her cry since her own mother had died, and it broke my heart, because I understood that she was grieving. She was grieving the son she thought she had, and she was grieving the future she had imagined, and she was grieving the version of herself that had believed she had understood her own child. I sat with her while she cried, and I did not defend myself, and I did not rush her, because I had had 30-some years to get used to this idea, and she had had 20 minutes. That is a lesson I want to pass on to anyone who is preparing for a conversation like this. The people who love you need time. Not forever, but some. And if you can give them the time, and if they can use the time well, you can sometimes come out the other side of the conversation still holding each other's hands. My father was harder. My father is a man of few words and fewer feelings expressed out loud, and when I told him, he stood up from the kitchen table, and he walked out of the house, and he did not come back for 3 days. I want to tell you that I handled his absence with grace, but I did not. I called my sister crying. I called Dr. Vega. I sat on the floor of my mother's guest room, and I thought that I had lost him forever, and I thought about how the price of being myself was going to be losing the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle and how to change a tire and how to shake another person's hand. And then on the 3rd evening he came back. He walked into the kitchen where I was helping my mother with dishes, and he stood in the doorway, and he looked at me, and he said, "I don't understand this." And I said, "I know." And he said, "But you're my kid." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I'm going to need some time." And I said, "Take all the time you need." And then he walked over and he dried a plate, and we did the dishes together, and we did not talk about it again for almost a year, but he did not leave. He stayed. And staying, I have come to believe, is one of the most underrated forms of love. My brother did not stay. I will not go into the details, because they belong as much to him as to me, and I have tried, in the years since, to respect his right to his own story. What I will say is that he could not accept who I was, and he told me so, and he told me in words that I will not repeat here because I do not want to give them any more life than they have already had. We have not spoken in 11 years. I hope someday that we will. I have written him letters that I have not sent. I have kept a small box, not unlike the one I kept under the floorboard as a child, and in it I keep the letters, and I keep photographs from when we were young, and sometimes on his birthday I sit with the box, and I remember the boy who taught me how to whistle, and I forgive him again because I have learned that forgiveness is not a single act but a practice, and it is a practice I do for myself as much as for him. My sister, the one who found me in her cardigan, was the first person in my family to call me Charleen out loud. She did it on the phone, casually, in the middle of a sentence about groceries, and I had to sit down on the floor of my kitchen because my knees stopped working. She said, "Oh, and I meant to ask, does Charleen still like that raspberry jam I sent last time?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Good, I'll send more." And that was it. That was the whole moment. I've been told all my life that grand gestures are what love looks like, and I am here to tell you that grand gestures are only the loudest form of love. The quietest form, the one that changes lives, is the form that treats you like you were always yourself, even in a sentence about jam. I want to talk now because I think it matters about the parts of this journey that are not about identity, but about responsibility. Because I have come to believe that becoming yourself is not only a matter of self-discovery, it is also a matter of self-conduct. I hurt people on my way to becoming Charleen. I hurt Elena, most of all. I hurt my parents by making them wait so long for truth I could have shared sooner if I had been braver. I hurt friends by disappearing from their lives during the years I could not bear to be seen. I hurt myself by hiding for so long that I nearly forgot there was a person underneath the hiding. And part of becoming Charleen has been, and continues to be, making amends where I can, and accepting that where I cannot, I still owe an honest reckoning. I wrote Elena a letter about 5 years after we ended things. I did not write it to ask for anything. I wrote it to tell her that I was sorry, and to name specifically what I was sorry for, because a vague apology is not really an apology. It is a request for absolution disguised as one. I told her that I was sorry I had lied to her, and I named the lies. I told her I was sorry that I had let her plan a wedding with a person who is not fully present in the relationship. I told her that I was sorry I had used her love as a shelter from a truth I owed her. I did not ask her to write back. She did, eventually months later, a short note that said only, "Thank you, and I am glad you are living your life, and I have moved on, and I hope you have too." That note is one of the most valuable things I own. It taught me that a person can be gracious even to someone who did not deserve their grace, and that if you are the person who did not deserve it, you should not squander it by asking for more. I want to talk about work, too, because so much of the conversation about people like me focuses on the private and the personal, and forgets that most of us also have jobs and bills and Tuesdays. I worked, at the time I began to transition socially, at a mid-sized firm that did technical work I will not describe in detail because the specifics don't matter. I was good at my job. I had been good at it for years. And when I decided that I was going to begin coming to work as Charleen, I sat down with my manager, a woman named Priya, and I told her, plainly, what I was planning. I did not ask for permission. I told her what was going to happen, and I asked for her partnership in making it as smooth as possible for the team. Priya was, and is, one of the finest human beings I have ever worked with. She said, "Okay, what do you need?" And I told her. And she made it happen. Not perfectly, because these things are never perfect, but honestly, and with the kind of pragmatic kindness that changes companies from the inside. Not everyone at work was Priya. There were people who stopped inviting me to lunch. There was a colleague, a man I had considered a friend, who began to speak to me only in emails, even when we were sitting 8 feet apart. There was a client who requested, quietly, that I not be assigned to their account anymore, and Priya, to her enormous credit, told me about this directly and asked me how I wanted to handle it, and I said, "I want to keep the account," and she said, "Then we'll keep the account," and we did. I want to say clearly that I did not lose my job. I did not lose my career. I did have to work harder for a while to prove that I was the same competent person I had always been, even though nothing about my work had changed. This is one of the small, exhausting injustices of a life like mine. You have to keep proving that becoming yourself did not make you worse at everything else you were already good at. I want to talk about the mental health piece too, because it is central, and I would be lying to you if I pretended that everything got better the moment I became Charleen. It did not. There were new problems. There was the exhaustion of constantly being looked at. There was the specific fatigue of walking into a room and knowing that some percentage of the people in it were going to spend the next hour trying to figure out what I was, when I already knew and had done the work to know. There was the fear of walking home alone at night, which was a fear I had not carried in the same way before, and which taught me a great deal about what many women live with every day. There was the loneliness of being, for a while, a person without a category in a world that runs on categories. All of these things required continuing care. I stayed in therapy. I have stayed in therapy in one form or another ever since. I take my mental health as seriously as I take my physical health, and I do not consider this an indulgence. I consider it maintenance, the way you would maintain a car you needed to drive for the rest of your life. I want to say something to the young people who might be watching because I know some of you are. Please, if you are exploring who you are, do it slowly. Do it with people you trust, if you can find them. If you cannot find them yet, find a professional, someone whose job it is to help you sit with hard questions without pushing you toward easy answers. Do not let anyone rush you, including yourself. The version of me that I am today was not built in a weekend or a year. She was built over decades of careful, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful work. And she is not a finished product either. I am still becoming her, and I hope I will still be becoming her when I am 80. That I have come to believe is what a life is. It is a becoming that does not end. I also want to say something to the parents and to the siblings and to the friends and to the partners and to the coworkers who might be watching because you are part of this story too, even if you have never lived a moment of it yourselves. The most important thing you can do for someone in your life who is exploring who they are is to remain in the room. You do not have to understand everything. You do not have to celebrate everything. You do not have to abandon your own beliefs or your own questions. You only have to stay in the room. My father did not understand me the day I told him. He did not understand me a year later. I am not sure he fully understands me now. But he stayed in the room and he dried the dishes and he came to my 30th birthday party and he sat next to me at my sister's wedding and he introduced me to a distant cousin by my correct name without stumbling, and those are the things that built the relationship we have today. Understanding is a beautiful thing, but presence is a durable one, and presence, in the end, is what family is made of. I got involved several years into my transition with volunteer work at the same community clinic where I had first met Dr. Vega. I answered phones at first. Then I helped facilitate a support group, the same kind of group I had first walked into with folded hands and a racing heart. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to present myself as a mentor or a savior. I am neither. I am simply a person a few steps further down a road that many people are walking, and I have found that turning around occasionally to offer a hand to the person behind me is one of the most meaningful things I do with my time. I have learned more from the people in those support groups than I could ever teach them. I have met a 70-year-old woman who began her transition at 68 because her husband of 40 years finally passed, and she felt, for the first time, free to become herself. I have met a 20-year-old who decided, after 2 years of exploration, that they were not trans at all, that they were simply a man who liked wearing dresses sometimes, and that this was a complete and beautiful thing to be. I have met people who moved forward with medical transition, and people who did not, and I have learned that there is no correct version of this journey. There is only the version that is true for the person walking it. I want to talk about romance again because it is a part of the human experience that does not go away just because you have done a great deal of work on yourself. Several years after Elena, I met a man named Idris at a bookstore, of all places. He was reaching for the same book I was reaching for, an old paperback of poems by a Polish writer neither of us had heard of before that afternoon, and we laughed about it, and he asked if I wanted to get coffee, and I said yes, and I told him, before we had even finished the coffee, who I was and how I had come to be her. I told him because I had learned from Elena that a relationship built on a hidden truth is not a relationship. It is a rehearsal for a heartbreak. Idris listened. He asked thoughtful questions. He did not perform acceptance, and he did not perform confusion. He drank his coffee, and at the end he said, "Thank you for telling me, and I would like to see you again if you would like to see me. We have been together for 9 years. He is not perfect, and I am not perfect, and our life is not a movie, but it is a life, and it is honest, and I did not have to build it out of hiding." I want to speak before I close about the responsibility that I feel now at this stage of my life to be honest about the mistakes I made, because I have noticed that stories like mine often get told in one of two ways. Either the person telling the story presents themselves as a victim of everyone around them, or they present themselves as a hero who overcame everything through sheer force of will. Neither of those stories is true, in my experience. In my experience, I was both hurt and hurtful. I was both misunderstood and, at times, unwilling to be understood. I was both a person who needed grace and a person who owed it to others. And I think the most honest thing I can offer you today is that I have tried imperfectly to hold all of those truths at the same time without letting any one of them cancel out the others. I am not a victim of my life. I am not a hero of it either. I am simply a person who has tried, most days, to do the next honest thing, and who has on many days failed, and who has, on many other days, gotten up the next morning and tried again. I want to say one more thing about the practical realities of a life like mine, because I think the internet is full of the extremes and short on the middle. The middle of my life most days looks very ordinary. I go to work, I come home. Idris and I cook dinner together, badly, and we argue about whether the pasta is done. I call my mother on Sundays. I visit my sister and her children twice a year. My niece, who is now 9 years old, has known me only as Charleen, has never known me as anything else, and to her I am simply an aunt who tells slightly better jokes than the other aunts. I water my plants. I read books. I fall asleep on the couch, and Idris covers me with a blanket. I have a body that is not exactly the body I would have designed for myself, and I have made peace with most of it, and I am still working on peace with the rest. I have a face in the mirror that looks like mine most days, and on the days it doesn't, I have learned to be gentle with the reflection, because she has been through a lot. If there is one insight I want to leave you with from all of this, it is that identity is not a destination. It is a language. And like any language, it can be learned, and it can be spoken clumsily at first, and it can be refined, and it can be shared, and it can sometimes be misunderstood. But the goal of speaking a language is not to arrive at a final sentence. The goal is to be able to communicate the truth of your inner life to yourself and to the people who love you. I spent 30 years unable to speak my own native language, and the cost of that silence was enormous, not only to me but to the people who loved me and were trying to hear me through a wall I had built out of fear. Learning to speak was hard. Learning to speak in public was harder. But the alternative was a silence I could not survive, and I chose speech imperfectly, and I have not regretted it, even on the days when speech has been expensive. I want to close by returning to something I said at the beginning about grieving the person I used to be. I do grieve him, sometimes. He was a good person in his way. He was kind to animals, and he was patient with children, and he tried, even when he was drowning, to be someone his family could be proud of. He carried me for 30-some years, and he did it under conditions I would not wish on anyone, and I owe him a debt of gratitude that I try to pay by living the life he could not live. When I light a candle on the anniversary of the day I told my mother, which I do every year, I light it as much for him as for me. I thank him for keeping me alive long enough for me to become myself. And then I blow out the candle and I go make dinner with Idris, and I live another day of a life he made possible. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.